The last temple on Earth burned on a Tuesday morning in Geneva, and Commander James Okonkwo watched the flames from his apartment window with a glass of coffee in his hand. He felt nothing except perhaps a mild sense of relief that humanity had finally moved past its childhood. The smoke rose into the gray sky and disappeared among the clouds while news drones circled the site and broadcast the event to every corner of the solar system. Dear Elena Vasquez stood before the cameras in her white ceremonial robes and held up the final physical copy of combined religious texts that had been preserved in the vault beneath the old United Nations building. "Today we graduate," she announced to the billions watching across Earth and the colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter. "Today we acknowledge that humanity needs no gods, no spirits, no divine intervention to navigate the cosmos. We have reason, we have science, we have each other." The crowd erupted in applause, and Vasquez placed the ancient book into the ceremonial. Flamio Okonkwo raised his glass in a silent toast to progress and drained the last of his coffee across the city. In a small basement room that had once been a Catholic chapel, Sister Maria Chun knelt before a makeshift altar and whispered prayers that no one else could hear. She was 47 years old and one of perhaps 1,000 clergy members left on Earth who still practiced in secret. The Global Rationality Act had not made belief illegal exactly, but it had made public worship impossible and removed all protections for religious institutions. Chun had watched over the past decade as temples became museums, as mosques were converted into libraries, as churches transformed into community centers stripped of all sacred purpose. She had warned the council that humanity was making a mistake. She had stood before them and quoted from texts both ancient and modern about the dangers of absolute certainty in any direction. They had thanked her politely and dismissed her concerns as the expected resistance from those who could not adapt to progress now. She kept her vigil alone and wondered if anyone heard her prayers anymore. Seismic readings began that same afternoon. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was monitoring the global sensor network from his station in Tokyo when the first anomaly appeared on his screens, a tremor beneath Jerusalem. Magnitude 3.2. Nothing unusual except for its precise geometric pattern. Before he could investigate further, another reading came through from Mecca, then Varanasi, and Kyoto. Within an hour, his system was flagging unusual seismic activity at 17 locations around the world, all of them sites of ancient worship. Tanaka reported his findings to the Geological Survey Commission and received an automated response thanking him for his data submission. The patterns were attributed to coincidental tectonic stress redistribution following the recent removal of massive stone structures from these locations. Case closed. Investigation unnecessary. Tanaka stared at his screens and felt uncertain for the first time in his career. The readings were too synchronized, too regular, but he filed his report and moved on to other work because science had no room for superstitious thinking. 3 days after the burning of the last temple, the Koresh Dominion fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. Their ships numbered in the thousands, each one the size of a small city. Their weapons capable of cracking planets like eggs. The Earth Defense Force detected them immediately and went to full alert. Okonkwo was pulled from his morning briefing and rushed to the command center beneath Geneva, where Admiral Sarah Kowalski was already coordinating with fleet commanders across the system. Status, Okonkwo demanded as he took his position at the tactical display. Hostile fleet. Origin unknown. Composition beyond our current threat assessment parameters. Kowalski replied without looking away from her screens. They're jamming our long range communications, but we're getting telemetry from our outer sensor nets. They're not slowing down. The display showed the Koresh fleet moving in perfect formation toward the inner system, and every predictive algorithm showed the same conclusion. Earth at perhaps 72 hours before they arrived in strike range. Okonkwo had served in the defense force for 23 years and commanded fleets against pirates and separatist colonies, had trained for hostile first contact scenarios 100 times in simulation. Nothing had prepared him for this, wrong combat projections. He ordered. The AI systems analyzed the available data and presented their conclusions in cold, numerical terms. Earth's defensive capabilities versus the approaching fleet resulted in a 0.003% chance of survival. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of machinery and the distant rhythm of ventilation systems. "Get me a channel to the civilian government," Kowalski said finally. "We need to begin evacuation protocols for essential personnel and genetic archives." Okonkwo nodded and turned to coordinate with the Mars colonies when a new alert flashed across every screen in the command center. The seismic readings that Tanaka had reported 3 days earlier had intensified by a factor of 50. Jerusalem was showing tremors of magnitude 7. Mecca was reporting magnitude 8.3. Varanasi, Kyoto, Machu Picchu, Stonehenge, and a dozen other sites around the world were experiencing simultaneous earthquakes that should have been causing catastrophic damage. Yet no damage was being reported. Instead, witnesses on the ground were describing something impossible. The Earth itself was opening at these ancient sites, and something massive was rising from beneath. Okonkwo pulled up the satellite feed from Jerusalem and watched in disbelief as the ground split in perfectly geometric patterns, and a structure of crystalline metal emerged into the sunlight. It was enormous, easily 100 stories tall, shaped like no building he had ever seen. Its surface caught the light and reflected patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched. Similar reports flooded in from every other location. 17 massive structures rising simultaneously from beneath the Earth's crust at sites that had been sacred to humanity for thousands of years. What am I looking at? Kowalski whispered. No one had an answer in her basement chapel. Sister Maria Chen felt the tremor through the floor and knew in her bones that something fundamental had changed. She climbed the stairs to street level and stepped out into the afternoon sun, just in time to see the structure rising from the ruins of the old cathedral district 3 kilometers away. Its surface was covered in symbols she recognized from the forbidden texts she had preserved: angels and demons, mandalas and runes, totems and glyphs from every faith tradition humanity had ever known, all of them flowing together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Chen fell to her knees on the pavement and began to pray with tears streaming down her face. She prayed for understanding, for guidance, for forgiveness. She prayed that humanity had not waited too long to remember what it had abandoned above her. The structure continued to rise, and somewhere in the depths of its crystalline heart, something ancient began to wake. The Koresh ultimatum arrived exactly 48 hours after their fleet first appeared in Earth Sensor Range. Fleet Commander Zarthan broadcast his message on all frequencies in flawless human English and 17 other Earth languages. His face appeared on every screen across the planet and throughout the colonies. His features vaguely reptilian but clearly intelligent and utterly without mercy. Humans of the Sol System, he began. You are hereby notified that your species has been selected for integration into the Koresh Dominion. You will submit your governmental authority to our administration within 24 standard hours. Your military forces will stand down and accept decommissioning. Your population will be evaluated for useful skills and relocated as necessary to serve Dominion interests. Resistance will result in the complete sterilization of your world and all colonial holdings. This is not a negotiation. This is inevitability. The transmission ended, and Okonkwo stood in the command center surrounded by officers whose faces showed the same helpless rage he felt burning in his chest. They had run every simulation, consulted every tactical database, called in every favor from allied species they had encountered in the outer systems. nothing changed the mathematics of destruction. Earth's fleet of 300 warships against the Koresh Armada was like throwing pebbles at a mountain. "We fight anyway," Admiral Kowalski said quietly. "We make them pay for every meter of space they take." Okonkwo nodded because there was nothing else to do. A soldier fought, even when victory was impossible, because surrender meant accepting that human life had no value worth defending. He began issuing orders to mobilize every combat-capable vessel and prepare the orbital defense platforms for a battle they could not win while the military prepared for war. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in her office at the Unified Council building and stared at reports coming in from the 17 sites where the mysterious structures had emerged. The structures had stopped rising after reaching heights between 80 and 120 stories. They stood silent and motionless, their crystalline surfaces reflecting sunlight in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Scientific teams had been dispatched to study them, but every attempt to scan their interiors had failed. The material they were constructed from did not appear in any database. It was not metal in the conventional sense, not stone, not any known composite or alloy instruments, simply could not penetrate its surface. Vasquez had authorized drilling attempts at the Jerusalem site, and the drill bits had shattered against the structure's outer shell without leaving so much as a scratch. What disturbed her most were the symbol-shy resolution. Satellite imagery showed the structures covered in markings that matched religious iconography from dozens of Earth cultures. There were Christian crosses adjacent to Islamic crescents, Buddhist wheels next to Hindu gods, Norse runes intertwined with Aztec calendars. The patterns should have been chaotic and meaningless, but instead they seemed to flow together as if they were all expressions of some deeper underlying language. Vasquez had spent her career proving that religion was nothing more than humanity's primitive attempt to explain natural phenomena before science provided real answers. These structures challenged everything she had worked to establish. Sister Maria Chun had no authorization and no credentials, but she walked past security at the Jerusalem site by simply wearing a confident expression and carrying a tablet as if she belonged there. Guards were too overwhelmed by the chaos to question one more person claiming to be part of the research team. She approached the base of the structure and placed her hand against its surface. The material was neither warm nor cold, neither smooth nor rough. It felt alive in a way she could not articulate. Chen had brought with her fragments of texts she had preserved during the purge of religious materials. These were not the popular scriptures that most people knew, but obscure writings from mystical traditions, apocryphal books that the mainstream faiths had rejected, ancient warnings passed down through secret lineages of believers. She found references to guardians placed in the earth by the divine, by ancient teachers, by beings who had loved humanity enough to give them a final defense. The texts called them covenant keepers, the army of the faithful, the warriors of the Last Testament. They would sleep beneath the sacred places of the world and draw strength from human devotion, from prayers and songs and the spiritual energy of billions of souls reaching toward something greater than themselves. They would remain dormant unless two conditions were met. First, humanity must face an existential threat from beyond. Second, humanity must have abandoned the covenant, forsaken the faith, forgotten how to believe. Only then would they rise for one final battle before returning to dust. Chen read these passages and felt ice in her veins. She pulled out her tablet and began attempting to contact anyone in the government who might listen. The seismic readings intensified again on the third day after the structures emergence. Dr. Tanaka watched his instruments and documented tremors that should have been tearing cities apart but somehow caused no damage whatsoever. The energy was flowing upward from deep within the Earth's mantle, following precise geometric pathways that converged on the 17 structures. Then they moved. The structure in Jerusalem shifted first. its massive form unfolding like a flower blooming in accelerated time crystalline wings spread from its back. Each one spanning kilometers arms emerged from its torso, 6 of them, each ending in hands that held weapons of pure light. A face became visible within the structure's upper section. Beautiful and terrible. Neither male nor female, neither human nor alien. It looked like every angel ever depicted in religious art, and like none of them, it looked like hope and judgment combined into physical form. The other 16 structures followed within minutes, each one unique in its details, but clearly part of the same unified design. The structure in Mecca unfolded into a form that incorporated flowing calligraphy into its very substance. The one in Kyoto bloomed with architectural elements from Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. The Guardian, rising from Stonehenge, carried weapons forged in the style of Celtic mythology. They were warriors. Chun realized as she watched the transformation on her tablet screen. They were humanity's army, built from the faith of countless generations, powered by the collective spiritual energy of billions who had prayed and believed and reached toward the divine. And they were weak. She could see it in the way they moved. Slow and uncertain, like someone waking from a long illness. She could see it in the way their light flickered and dimmed, in the way their forms seemed unstable. The abandonment of faith had starved them nearly to death. They had just enough strength for one battle, just enough power for a single desperate defense. Then they would crumble and fade forever. A transmission burst from all 17 Guardians. Simultaneously, it came in every human language at once, broadcast on every frequency, echoing in the minds of every person who heard it. The covenant is broken, yet the debt remains. You who have forsaken us, we defend you still. One final battle we offer, then we return to dust. Remember what you have lost, or lose everything you have, in the Koresh command ship. Fleet Commander Zartham stared at his tactical displays and felt an emotion he had not experienced in 3 centuries of conquest. Fear. His sensors were showing energy readings from the 17 structures that exceeded anything his species had encountered. The weapons they carried registered as threats to his capital ships, battle stations. He ordered, "Accelerate approach vector. We strike before they fully activate." Young pilot Relkith sat in her fighter cockpit aboard one of the Dominion carriers and recited the prayers her grandmother had taught her before she died. The Koresh had abandoned their gods 5,000 years ago in favor of pure militant expansion, but Relkith's family had secretly kept the old ways alive, and she had grown up hearing stories about divine warriors who protected the faithful. She had thought they were just stories. Now she watched the tactical feeds showing the Guardians rising from Earth and wondered if her people had made the same mistake as the humans. The Guardians launched themselves into space with impossible grace. Despite their massive size, they moved toward the approaching Koresh fleet, and their weapons began to glow with building power. Okonkwo watched from the command center and felt something crack open in his chest. It might have been wonder. It might have been terror. It might have been the first stirring of faith in a heart that had believed in nothing but reason for 40 years. The first Guardian reached the outer edge of the Koresh fleet and swept one of its massive, light-forged swords through a destroyer that was still twice the size of Earth's largest warship. The alien vessel split cleanly in half and exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the darkness of space. The other Guardians engaged moments later, and the battle began in earnest. Okonkwo watched the tactical display and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The Guardians moved like dancers, like martial artists, like beings who had been designed for this singular purpose. They dodged weapons fire that should have been impossible to evade at those speeds. They struck with precision that no computer targeting system could match. Each swing of their weapons destroyed ships that had taken the Koresh decades to construct. But There were only 17 guardians and thousands of Karish vessels. More critically, Okonkwo could see the energy readings on his instruments beginning to fluctuate and declined. The guardians were running on reserves, on the last dregs of power accumulated over millennia from the prayers of believers who no longer existed. Sister Maria Chum had finally reached someone who would listen. Dr. Elena Vasquez had agreed to meet her in a conference room at the council building. Though Vasquez's expression made it clear she expected to hear nothing but religious delusion, Chun spread her preserved texts across the table and explained what she had pieced together from fragments and warnings written by mystics who had foreseen this moment. They're dying, Chum said bluntly. The guardians were meant to be sustained by faith, by the spiritual energy of humanity's collective belief. We stopped feeding them 10 years ago when we began dismantling the temples. We cut them off completely 3 days ago, when we burned the last sacred texts. Vasquez stared at the ancient writings with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. You're suggesting that prayer has measurable energy? She asked. That belief can power these machines? They're not machines, Chung corrected. They're something else. Something that exists at the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. Call it quantum consciousness. Call it morphic resonance. Call it the collective unconscious made manifest. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that they need us to believe in them, or they'll fail. Vasquez stood and walked to the window where she could see one of the guardians in the distance, its form visible even from Geneva as it fought in low orbit. She had built her entire career on provable facts and measurable phenomena. Everything Chun was describing sounded like mysticism and wishful thinking, yet the guardians were real. They had emerged from beneath the earth, and they were fighting an alien fleet that humanity had no other defense against. What are you proposing? Vasquez asked. Finally, Chun took a deep breath. We need to broadcast a message to every human in the solar system. We need to tell them the truth about what the guardians are and what they need. And then we need to ask people to believe, to pray, to meditate, to reach out toward whatever conception of the divine or the transcendent resonates with them, not because it's rational, but because it's necessary. Vasquez turned back to face her. You understand that this could undo everything we've accomplished. The Rationality Act, the advancement of scientific thinking, the liberation from superstition. You're asking me to tell humanity to go back to the Dark Ages. I'm asking you to save our species. Chun replied. In orbit above Earth, the guardian that had risen from Jerusalem took a direct hit from a Koresh plasma cannon. The weapon was designed to bore through planetary crust, and it struck the guardian's torso with enough force to vaporize a mountain. The guardian's form flickered, and dim cracks appeared in its crystalline structure. For a moment it seemed to freeze in space, neither advancing nor retreating. Then it raised its sword again and destroyed the ship that had fired on it. But Okonkwo could see the damage in his redoubts. Guardian's energy signature had dropped by 30%. It was bleeding power, losing cohesion. For more hits like that, and it would shatter completely. He pulled up the tactical overview and saw similar damage across multiple guardians. The one from Kyoto had lost 2 of its 6 arms. The one from Stonehenge had a massive crack running down its center. They were losing across the command center. Every officer wore the same expression of helpless fury. They had weapons, ships, soldiers ready to fight. None of it mattered because the battle was happening at a scale they could not affect. Then Vasquez's face appeared on every screen in the facility. She had authorized an emergency broadcast to every device in the solar system. Okonkwo watched as the woman who had burned the last religious text 3 days ago prepared to speak. Citizens of Earth and the colonies, Vasquez began, and her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. I'm going to tell you something that contradicts everything I have taught and believed for my entire career. The structures that emerge from our planet are not weapons in the conventional sense. They are guardians, created or summoned or manifested by the faith of our ancestors. They are powered by belief, by spiritual energy, by the act of reaching toward something greater than ourselves. We starved them when we abandoned our temples. We nearly killed them when we declared faith obsolete. Now they are fighting to defend us with the last of their strength, and they are losing. She paused, and Okonkwo saw her hands trembling slightly. I cannot tell you what to believe. I cannot prove that. Prayer will make a difference. But I am asking you, all of you, to try. Find whatever conception of the divine or the transcendent or the sacred that resonates in your heart. Pray to the gods of your ancestors. Meditate on the unity of all things. Sing the songs your grandmother taught you. Light a candle and hope. Believe in something. Anything beyond pure material existence. Not because I can prove it will work, but because doing nothing means certain extinction. The transmission ended and silence filled the command center. Okonkwo stared at the tactical display and waited to see if anything would change on Mars. In the domed cities that housed 3 million colonists, people began gathering in public squares. Some knelt, some stood. Some sat in meditation poses. They had no temples because the colonies had been built in the age of rationalities. So, they made temples of their bodies and their gathered presence on the moon bases, in the asteroid mining stations, on the research outposts orbiting Jupiter's moons. Humans stopped their work and turned their attention inward. A Buddhist miner in the asteroid belt began chanting sutras he had learned from his grandfather, and Muslim engineer on Ganymede knelt toward Earth and performed prayers he had not said since childhood. An atheist scientist on the moon closed her eyes and simply wished with all her heart for humanity to survive on Earth itself. Billions of people poured into the streets. They gathered at the sites where temples had once stood. They formed circles and held hands. They sang and cried and reached toward forces they did not understand. In Geneva, James Okonkwo left the command center and walked through the city streets until he found the ruins of the old church where his grandmother had taken him as a child. The building was gone, but the foundation stones remained. He knelt on the cold ground and tried to remember the words she had taught him. Our Father who art in heaven. The words felt foreign in his mouth after so many years. He pushed through the discomfort and continued, Hallowed be thy name. Around him, others were gathering and adding their voices to his. Some prayed in Arabic, some in Sanskrit, some in languages that had no words but only feeling. Sister Maria Chun stood at the base of the Guardian in Jerusalem, with tears streaming down her face and her hands raised to the sky. She prayed with every ounce of strength in her body. She prayed for forgiveness, for mercy, for one more chance and an orbit above the planet. The Guardians began to glow brighter. The change was measurable. Dr. Tanaka sat at his seismic monitoring station in Tokyo and watched as new energy readings flooded his instrument's power. Was flowing from billions of points across Earth and the colonies, converging on the 17 Guardians. In orbit, it was not electrical energy or thermal radiation or any form of power his instruments were designed to detect, yet there it was on his screens. Undeniable and growing stronger by the second. The Guardians' light intensified until they blazed like newborn stars. The cracks in their crystalline forms began to seal the Guardian from Kyoto, regenerated its lost arms in a cascade of light. The one from Jerusalem straightened and raised its sword high, and the weapon burned with renewed power. Okonkwo watched his tactical displays and allowed himself to feel something he had not permitted in days. Hope. The Guardians moved with renewed speed and struck with devastating force a squadron of Koresh cruisers attempted to flank the Guardian from Mecca and found themselves facing a warrior that moved faster than their targeting. Systems could track the Guardian's blade, swept through all 6 ships in a single stroke on the Koresh command ship. Fleet Commander Zarthan reviewed the battle reports with growing alarm. His fleet had lost 200 vessels in the past hour. The energy signatures from the 17 enemy combatants had increased by a factor of 10. Predictive algorithms that had given him 99% chance of victory now showed the battle outcome as uncertain analysis. He demanded from his tactical officer, "The enemy forces are being reinforced." The officer reported, "Energy transmissions from the planet's surface and all colonial holdings. Unknown power source. Classification impossible." Zarthan watched the tactical display and made a decision. If conventional weapons could not overwhelm these Guardians, he would use the weapon the Dominion reserved for worlds that refused to submit. Prepared the World Breaker. He ordered his bridge crew turned to stare at him. The World Breaker was a quantum singularity generator capable of destabilizing the planet's core and tearing it apart from within. It was a weapon of last resort, used only when the Dominion needed to make an example of a species so thoroughly that no other civilization would dare resist. "Commander," his first officer said carefully, "the World Breaker will destroy the planet and everything on it. There will be no population to integrate, no resources to harvest. Then we will harvest nothing but fear." Zarthan replied, "Every species that hears what happened here will know the cost of resistance. Arm the weapon on Earth." Okonkwo received a priority alert from deep space monitoring stations. The Koresh fleet was reconfiguring, forming a defensive sphere around one of their largest vessels. Energy readings indicated they were charging something massive. His eye systems identified the signature and delivered their analysis with clinical precision. Word glass weapon. Estimated time to firing readiness 12 minutes. Probability of planetary survival 0%. Okonkwo stood frozen as the information settled over him like ice water. They had been winning. The Guardians had been pushing back the Koresh fleet, and now the enemy was going to simply shatter the planet and everyone on it. "Get me Vasquez," he said, and his voice sounded distant even to his own ears. But before the connection could be made, every screen in the command center went white. A voice spoke in his mind. In everyone's mind simultaneously, it was the Guardian's voice, all 17. Speaking as one. "We see the weapon. We understand the threat. We will form a barrier. Continue to believe. Give us your faith, and we will give you survival." The Guardians in orbit abandoned their attack on the Koresh fleet and moved to position themselves between Earth and the enemy flagship. They linked hands, their massive forms creating a chain of light that encircled the planet. Their bodies began to flatten and spread, transforming from warriors into a shield. Okonkwo watched the transformation and understood what they were attempting. They were going to absorb the full force of the World Breaker. They were going to take a weapon designed to kill planets and let it strike them. Instead, it would destroy them completely, but it might save Earth. Sister Maria Chun felt the Guardian's intention ripple through the collective consciousness of every praying soul on Earth. She understood that this was the moment of ultimate sacrifice. The Guardians were offering themselves completely, and they needed humanity to meet them halfway. She began to run through the streets of Jerusalem, shouting to everyone she passed, "Pray harder. Believe with everything you have. They need us." Others took up the cry and spread it through the city. The message rippled outward and across the planet and through the colonies. People who had been praying with casual hope now threw themselves into it with desperate intensity in the ruins of his grandmother's church. Okonkwo found himself surrounded by hundreds of people. They were cramped together in the foundation, shoulder to shoulder, and someone had lit candles that flickered in the evening air. An elderly woman began singing a hymn in a language he did not recognize. Others joined her, adding harmonies and counter-melodies. Osk had never been a singer. He had always found public displays of emotion uncomfortable and excessive, but now he opened his mouth and let sound pour out. He did not know if he believed in God or gods or any specific theology. He believed in humanity's right to survive. He believed that sometimes faith was a choice you made not because it was logical, but because surrender was unacceptable. He believed in the guardians who were about to die defending a species that had abandoned them. He sang and prayed and poured every ounce of his will toward those massive crystalline forms in orbit on the Koresh flagship. The world breaker reached full charge as Zarthan gave the order, and the weapon fired a beam of impossible darkness, lanced across space toward Earth. It was a wound in reality itself, a tear in the fabric of existence where it passed. Stars dimmed and space itself seemed to recoil. The Guardian's shield met the world breaker beam, and the universe screamed. The impact was visible from Earth as a flash of light, so bright it turned night into day across half the planet. The Guardians absorbed the weapon's fury and held their ground. Their bodies cracked and shattered. Their light flickered and began to fade, but they held. The world breaker beam struck them and stopped. Unable to penetrate to the world behind their linked form, Sokanko felt tears on his face and did not wipe them away around him. People were crying and singing and praying with voices hoarse from desperation. The energy readings from Earth spiked again. Billions of people focusing their will, their hope, their faith towards 17 dying warriors. The Guardian's light flared brighter. Their cracked forms began to heal even as the Worldbreaker continued to tear at them. And then something extraordinary happened. The Guardians began to change. Their crystalline bodies shifted and evolved. They were no longer just absorbing the energy from human faith. They were channeling it, transforming it, becoming something new, a fusion of ancient covenant and modern human will. They were evolving beyond their original designing, the command center. Okonkwo watched as the readings on his displays went off scale. The Guardians were generating their own power now. Independent of the faith that had birthed them, they had been awakened by belief, but now they were sustained by humanity's collective determination to survive. The Worldbreaker beam faltered and failed. The Guardian's shield transformed into something more. They became a wave of light that swept across space toward the Koresh fleet, not to destroy, to disable. The wave washed over the enemy vessels, and every weapon system failed. Every engine shut down. Every hostile capability simply ceased to function. The Koresh fleet found itself drifting, helpless, in Earth's orbit, and the Guardians reformed into their warrior shapes and waited. They did not strike the killing blow. They stood ready, but held back. They were waiting for humanity to Chidio Okonkwo understood the question they were asking. Humanity had been given the power to destroy its enemies utterly. The choice of what to do with that power was theirs alone. He opened a channel to the Unified Council and found Vasquez already on the line. The decision cannot be yours alone, she said, or mine. This is a moment that will define who we are. Within minutes, they had organized a planetary vote. Every human in the solar system was asked a simple question: destroy the Koresh fleet or offer terms of surrender. The votes came in over the course of an hour. When they were tallied, 78% had chosen mercy. Humanity had remembered how to believe. Now it was choosing what kind of species it wanted to be. Okonkwo transmitted the surrender terms to Zarthan's flagship. The Koresh commander appeared on screen, his reptilian features showing an emotion that might have been shock. "You are sparing us," Zarthan said, and it was not quite a question. "We are offering you a choice," Okonkwo replied. "You came to conquer a godless species. Instead, you reminded us what we had lost. Now you can choose to learn from that or die ignorant." Zarthan stared at him for a long moment. Then the Koresh commander bowed his head in a gesture of submission. 3 months after the battle, Commander James Okonkwo stood at the edge of the solar system and watched the Guardians take their new position. They had not returned to dormancy as the ancient texts predicted. They had not crumbled to dust after their final battle. Instead, They had stationed themselves at 17 points around the outer rim of Sol's gravity while forming a protective perimeter that would alert humanity to any future threats. They were neither fully active nor truly sleeping. They existed in a state of watchful readiness, drawing minimal power from the steady current of human faith that now flowed toward them daily. Okonkwo had been appointed as the official liaison to the Guardians, a position that existed somewhere between military command and spiritual leadership. Spent his days learning to communicate with beings that existed partially outside normal reality. The Guardians did not speak in words exactly. Their communication came as feelings, impressions, cascading layers of meaning that resolved into understanding. They had told him their origin, though even now he was not certain he fully believed it. They were all of the possibilities at once. They were weapons left by an ancient alien species that had loved humanity. They were manifestations of the divine, sent by forces beyond mortal comprehension. They were projections of humanity's own collective unconscious, given form by millennia of faith and devotion. Guardians themselves seemed unconcerned with which explanation was correct. They simply were. And that was enough. Sister Maria-chan had been appointed as Okonkwo's co-liaison, representing the spiritual dimension of humanity's relationship with the Guardians. She stood beside him, now on the observation deck of the station they had built, to study and communicate with the nearest Guardian. "Do you believe yet?" Chun asked him with a slight smile. Okonkwo considered the question seriously. "I believe that faith is real," he said finally. "I believe it has measurable effects on reality. Whether there are gods behind that faith, or whether faith itself is the divine force, I cannot say, but I no longer think it matters as much as I once did." Chun nodded. "That is more honest than most of the council members would admit." Vasquez still insists, "We need to find a purely scientific explanation for the Guardians. Let her look." Okonkwo said, "Some questions are meant to remain questions. On Earth, the reconciliation had begun in earnest. Dr. Elena Vasquez had stepped down from her position as head of the Global Rationality Commission and helped establish the new temples. In its place, these were not churches or mosques in the traditional sense. They were spaces dedicated to exploration of the intersection between science and spirituality, reason and faith, the measurable and the mysterious. The first new temple had been built in Geneva, on the site where Vasquez had burned the last sacred text. She had insisted on that location as a reminder that certainty in any direction was dangerous. The building incorporated elements from every faith tradition humanity had ever developed. It had rooms for prayer and meditation. It had laboratories for studying consciousness and the effects of belief on physical reality. It had libraries that preserved both scientific papers and ancient wisdom texts. Most importantly, it had open forums where people could debate and question and seek understanding without fear of being labeled heretical or irrational. Vasquez herself spent most of her time in the new temple's research wing, leading studies on the nature of faith-based energy. She had teams measuring the electromagnetic signatures of prayer. She had quantum physicists examining the way belief seemed to affect probability distributions at the subatomic level. She had neuroscientists mapping the brain states of people. In deep meditation, she was searching for the mechanism by which faith affected reality. Many of her colleagues thought she was chasing shadows. Many religious leaders thought she was trying to reduce the divine to mere physics. Vasquez did not care. She had learned that the search for truth required holding multiple contradictory ideas simultaneously. Faith could be both a measurable force and a holy mystery. Science could coexist with wonder. The Koresh had not left the solar system. Their disabled fleet had been towed to a stable orbit around Neptune, where the survivors were being held in what amounted to comfortable imprisonment. Fleet Commander Zarthan had requested a meeting with the Unified Council and had made an unprecedented offer. He wanted to learn the Koresh had abandoned their gods 5,000 years ago. in favor of pure military expansion. They had conquered 300 species and absorbed them into the dominion through force. They had believed themselves superior because they had eliminated the weakness of faith. Then, they had encountered humanity's guardians and faced beings that should not exist according to their understanding of real. Elizathan had spent 3 months studying the records of the battle. He had interviewed human survivors about their experience of faith. He had requested access to the preserved text that Chun had protected. Was starting to believe that his species had made a terrible mistake. We became conquerors because we lost our connection to the sacred. He told the council during his testimony, we filled the emptiness with domination and called it strength. But strength without meaning is just destruction. We destroyed ourselves spiritually long before we started destroying others. The council had debated for weeks about what to do with the Kosh. Eventually, they offered conditional release. The aliens could return to their home systems if they agreed to abandon their policy of forced integration. They would be monitored, and any violation would bring the guardians to their doorsteps. Earthen had accepted the terms, but before he left, he had requested one additional thing. He wanted to take copies of Earth's sacred texts with him, wanted to bring them to his people and share what he had learned. I cannot promise we will understand, he told Vasquez and Chun as they gave him data files containing thousands of religious and philosophical works. The Koresh are not human, and our spiritual needs may be different, but we must try to remember what we forgot before we become something even worse than we already are. Pilot Relkith had been given a choice by her commander. She could return with the fleet to Koresh space, or she could remain in the Sol system as part of the first alien class at the new temple. Shrelkth had chosen to stay. She sat now in a meditation hall in the Geneva temple, surrounded by humans of every background, and recited the prayers her grandmother had taught her. The old Koresh words felt strange after so many years of silence, but she persisted because she understood that some things worth having required faith rather than proof. Commander Okonkwo visited Earth once a month to report to the council and check on the progress of the reconciliation. He always made time to return to the ruins of his grandmother's church. Someone had rebuilt a small chapel. On the foundation stones, it was simple and unadorned. Just 4 walls and a roof, with benches inside. Okonkwo sat in the chapel and thought about the journey humanity had taken. They had climbed from superstition to science. They had declared themselves free from the need for faith. They had nearly died. Because of that arrogance now, they were learning to walk a middle path between extremes. They were learning that reason without wonder was sterile, that faith without question was dangerous, that the universe was vast and strange and contained truths that could not be reduced to equations or encapsulated in doctrine. The Guardians had saved them, but more than that. The Guardians had taught them. They had shown humanity that the divine and the scientific were not opposites, but different languages describing the same ineffable reality. Sister Maria Chun joined him in the chapel, and they sat in comfortable silence. For a time, do you think we will remember? She asked finally. Will humanity hold on to this balance, or will we slide back toward one extreme or the other? Okonkwo thought about the question. I think we will struggle, he admitted. Every generation will have to choose between certainty and mystery. Some will embrace faith without question. Others will reject anything that cannot be measured. But now we have the Guardians to remind us. As long as they stand watch, we cannot forget completely. Chun smiled. That is a kind of grace. I suppose that our salvation required us to abandon certainty, that the only way forward was to admit we do not have all the answers. Above them, invisible but present in the collective awareness of humanity. The Guardians kept their vigil. They were watchers and warriors. They were mysteries and machines. They were proof that faith had power, and proof that some questions had no single answer. They were humanity's army, risen from the earth when humanity forsook the faith, and they would remain until humanity no longer needed them, or until the cosmos itself grew dark and cold in the new temple library. Vasquez finished her latest research paper on the quantum mechanics of belief. Her conclusions were simultaneously rigorous and inconclusive. Yes, faith affected reality in measurable ways.